Taskmaster is an enterprise capture platform, and Taskmaster for Accounts Payable is just one of the uses. So here I've got on my screen the job monitor, and I might have gotten an email that says, "Good morning, Bob, here's your work for today." And you can see I have a variety of different jobs, and they're in different states from pending to hold. And I'm going to go click on one of these, and why not click on the first one? So here, I've opened up the .edit view panel. So on the right side, I have a screen or an image of the invoice, and on the left side, I have a gray panel with several fields on it. That is the extracted data from either the invoice, the image on the right, or a database that we're connected to as well. You'll also notice several features here that are designed to help the operators. For one, it is a kind of eye-pleasing gray color, and there are certain color codes in the fields. If you can see here, there are green fields and there are some yellow fields. And the green fields are ones that are fairly high confidence without validation errors, and the yellow fields are a lower confidence field. And you'll notice that if you look at that one yellow field that's highlighted on the screen, Taskmaster points it out so the operator doesn't have to go looking for the error. And we'll get back to that in a moment. But you'll also notice certain features here. For example, over the postal code, it says here, the extracted data is 57501, and the image above that is actually a snippet of the data. So let's click through that. If I click on this field, you'll notice that I have not only the image of the extracted data from the image, I have the data from a snippet of the image over here on the right, but I also show the context of that data. So if I need to refer back to the original form, I can certainly do that. And as I click through the fields on the screen, you'll notice how I bounce around to various areas all over the document. So Taskmaster doesn't necessarily care where the information is on the form. In fact, it doesn't really care if the information is on the form, as long as it's not a required field. You'll also notice there are certain fields here that have no snippet above that. That's because those fields were actually extracted from a database. In this case, the vendor table, showing me that XYZ hardware in postal code 57501 has a vendor ID of TS73182. So it has populated those fields from the database keyed off of, in this case, the postal code. And I have other fields, so this is a PO number, and you'll also see that I have certain other features, and these are completely editable if you'd like. So in this case, this is a PO'd invoice. Why? Because I have a PO number here. I also have other items here, such as add a new fingerprint, and we'll get back to that in a few moments, and then routing instructions, so I can do some basic workflow, if you would, within Taskmaster. Taskmaster is also set up for multinational invoices as well. So here, this is a U.S. invoice, so we have sales tax, but no VAT or GST taxes. If I was in the area that had VAT and GST taxes or provincial taxes, I could populate those fields automatically. Let's get back to the issues here that we were looking at before. So earlier, we looked at this field, and the two X's here were highlighted in red. That's because if you look at this enlarged snippet of the data, or if you could look really closely here, you'll notice that those two X's are in fact touching. So Taskmaster read it correctly, but Taskmaster said, "I'm not 100% sure that this is correct. Mr. Operator, you should look at this and see, is it correct?" And yes, in fact, it was. So I could either ignore that or click through that and move on to my next fields. I also have things such as line items down below. They are automatically extracted as a feature within Taskmaster AP. So here's a button called Find Details. So when I'm building a new fingerprint for these invoices, I may want not to type in all of this data. I may want to simply set up one line item and then click the Find Details button to fill in the rest. Calculate Blank allows me to do things such as I have a quantity and an extended price but no unit price. Calculate Blank would fill that in. Polar or PO line reconciliation allows Taskmaster to match the PO database. So for example here, I have my items on my purchase order, and I have my items on the invoice, and they are auto-matched by Taskmaster. one line item down here, the pro discount, was not on the purchase order, so it is not going to auto match. Let's bring one of these down so we can actually match one of those manually and show you how that would happen. So in this case, my purchase order ordered line item 40 on my purchase order, quantity 1, my item ID 13001-AB, and then the shipping charge was $400. Taskmaster Auto matched that because of the purchase order number, the line item numbers matched. But if they didn't match or it was outside of a tolerance, an operator would simply highlight both fields, click on them, and move them up, and you'll notice that 3 were matched by Taskmaster and 1 was matched by the operator. So Polar would allow you to process and send through a clean matched invoice to your ERP or repository system if it applied. Very powerful tool. And we'll get back to this other button here, Sticky, in a few moments. So I'm going to go on. I'm going to submit this invoice. This invoice is perfectly fine for processing. And now here's another invoice, but this one has a red field. The reason that field is in red is because there was no leap year in 2009. So here I'm going to say I want to change that because I'm an administrator to a valid date, and then I'm going to move on. So you can see how Taskmaster can enable significant productivity gains simply by only handling the bad fields. I'm not keying in data, I'm not typing in data, I'm not clicking in data. All I'm doing is validating a few fields on each form, not entering 30 or 40 fields per invoice. So here's an invoice we haven't seen before. And now Taskmaster has certain rules in it that enable the operator to go ahead and pre-populate this form so it can pre-configure some of these things. So for example, down here, you'll notice that the sales tax has been found. That uses a rule called IntelliCate. So IntelliCate looks at things such as invoice number or purchase order if they were configured, and in this case they're not, so we can show you some other features. But what IntelliCate does is it looks for combinations of words. So here we have sales space tax, and the first letter of each word is capitalized. So what IntelliCate does is it looks for that combination or many other combinations of sales tax or invoice number or purchase order number, and it looks left, looks right, looks up, and looks down until it finds, in this case, a currency value of $42.92. So it's already pre-populated that. It's also done that on the invoice date, but you'll notice that it only grabbed the first couple of characters of that invoice date. The reason for that is the way IntelliCate works is it looks for the first word until it finds a space. And that's exactly what's happened here, whereas this space was introduced because of the font that this vendor chose to use. So I'm going to correct that here for a moment, simply by drawing a box or rubber banding around that date. And now I'm going to move on to populate the rest of this invoice. So, for example, I have a postal code. I'm simply clicking on these things, so I'm not introducing manual typing or errors. So as I click through these fields, I'm simply highlighting them, clicking on them, and moving on. So once I've gotten that through, I want to go ahead and now look for the vendor name. I'm going to do that from the database because I don't want to read that from every logo or every invoice coming in. It's always better to populate anything you can from a database because I've had more data there. So in this case, I'm going to type in the first couple of characters. I'm going to see busy car repair. I'm going to double-click busy car repair and populate both the vendor number and busy car repair. In many cases, I would have done that from the postal code, but then I wouldn't have shown you the database lookup. So now I've got a bunch of fields here, and I've got a pretty complete header and a footer here. But what I don't have is this invoice has line items on it, and I don't have them showing here. So this invoice would never validate because there are rules configured in Taskmaster that say the sum of all of these line items plus any taxes and shipping equal the total. But there are no line items, so Taskmaster could never approve this. So I'm going to go ahead and add some line items. And you'll notice that my field comes up, and as I click through this, now I can add in all of the line items here. And if I say, give me the SKU number, part number, item ID number, give me the item description. As I said earlier, Taskmaster will look for the first word until it finds a space, as here, trucking space dash space ticket. So I'm going to drag a box around what is available here. I'm going to grab the quantity. I'm going to grab the unit price now. And then I'm going to grab the line total. So now I can sit here and click in all of those fields, or I can type in all of those fields, or as I mentioned earlier, I have a button up here called Find Details. And what Find Details does is it does a grid match and matches all of those items here that follow the same pattern until that pattern changes. So I've clicked that Find Details button. It's extracted the 3 fields that I care about. And now if I go on to process this invoice, this is now a valid invoice. So here's a pretty unique feature to Taskmaster. I've got a second invoice in the same batch from the same vendor. So in this case, I could either type in all of that data, click in all of that data again, or hit the button that I said I would get back to a little while ago where it says Sticky Available. And as we mentioned before, we use a concept called fingerprints. So here I can click on the Sticky Fingerprint button and retrieve all of the information that it learned from the last invoice. It's still going to have that same issue with this date because of the font. So if I correct that, I've gotten all of the line items. This invoice will balance the moment I click the Submit button. Here's a different invoice. This is an invoice from France. So we have different formats here. So you'll notice the postal codes are different. My currency codes are different. I have no sales tax, but I have a VAT and a GST tax, and my invoice dates are different. So here, since I prefer to work in US Windows English, my system is automatically normalizing the dates and the currencies to something that I'm used to. If I was doing this invoice in Europe and all of the US invoices came in with US formats on it, Taskmaster would correct them to something that I am familiar with working on. So this invoice was gone through. I can move on to the next one. Here is a multi-page invoice. So as I look through this, I can say, what's the next image? Here's the second page of that, and here's the first page once again. But you'll notice that Taskmaster extracted the total amount here, but it's not on the first page. It actually exists on the second page. So if I go back to my second page, here's the shipping and here's the total amount. So now that this batch is finished, I can submit this batch and it would automatically export and be sent to my line of business application as well as my repository.